Welcome to Moments with Marianne. Allow me to interrupt your train of thought with something that may be one of the most interesting things you hear today. This is Marianne Pastana, and we're here today with special guest Tiffany Yates Martin, and she's here to share with us her new book, Intuitive Editing, a creative and practical guide to revising your writing. So let's welcome to the show, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me, Marianne. I love talking to you.
Oh my gosh, you're like one of my favorite people, and I love talking with you too. And when I found out you had this book, I was like, okay, hold the press. We need to talk. So I know this book is getting such rave reviews. How did it make you feel as an author, when you put this book out?
As an author, it felt great, but honestly, it felt even better from my work as an editor because while I am a published author under a pen name, I've been an editor for almost 30 years, and it really is the work of my heart. I love writing, and I will always write fiction probably, but editing is what I feel called to do. And so I had wanted for so many years to write a book that editing is often opaque to authors. And I wanted to be able to share with authors some of the techniques and tools that I have learned and developed over all these years in the business to be able to make what is often a difficult or daunting process to authors feel less overwhelming or opaque. So I think for years I felt like, well, who am I to write this book? And then as years went on, I found a couple of things. One, when I work with authors, frequently similar things came up in our work together. There would always be things around character development. There would always be things around, not with every author, but these are the most frequent things I would see about raising the stakes, about creating urgency, about keeping the story structure tight, that kind of thing. And I found I was I write long editorial letters to an author that I'm working with. And I found that I kept writing similar things over and over. And I kept thinking, gosh, I wish I could just give this as a guide to authors. And finally, I sat down and I started writing it. And I've written 6 novels that have been published. This was my first nonfiction, my first book on editing. And it was the first time I had ever written something that I understood what people meant when they said something writes itself. Like before I knew it, this thing was written. So the fact that it's been so well received is incredibly gratifying because I really feel like this is my life's work, and that the book is sort of not the culmination of it, but certainly a big milestone on the road.
Well, and it's helping so many people look at editing differently. So
Thanks.
Oh yeah, of course, my goodness. And before we go too far down the road, I would love for you to explain what intuitive editing is, because I think a lot of times people, they look at that and they're like, well, do I have to be psychic now?
So the book originally had a different title, which I have been roundly mocked for. So I'll go ahead and share it with you and your listeners so you can join that chorus. I called it The Best Version of Your Vision, which I still stand by. I love that. That to me is like the philosophy of how I edit. When I work with an author, I'm not trying to tear apart what they wrote or impose my intentions on the story. I want to help them tell the best version of the vision that they had for this story. So that was sort of the mindset I started from. But the way I work, I realized as I was writing is, I love writing, and I love writing craft books. You can't see me right now, but I have a whole shelf full of them behind me, like a lot of writers. And I think there's something to be gleaned from all of them. But what I don't think works well for an author is to take any of them and use them as dogma or the only way. Each of them you and I were talking about earlier, each of them is a tool in your toolbox. And so you take what resonates from each one and you disregard what doesn't, and you take what works for you on a certain story or at a certain time of your writing career. And maybe at another time you will use other elements of that, and you create your own system. So that's part of what intuitive editing means, is that there is no right way to do it. Just like there's no real right way to write. It's a matter of finding the system that works best for you. But also, I guess I am a little not woo-woo about it, but writing is right-brained and left-brained. So as an editor, I'm extremely analytical and I'm very left-brained, but I'm also a right-brained person. And I think that the skill of editing demands both, because you aren't just analyzing and assessing something, but you have to be able to grasp what the author's intentions are and help them see a path forward to get to the destination they're trying to get to. And you have to understand creativity and story and creative process. So it blends both of those. And intuitive editing sort of was walking with friends one day, desperately searching for a new title in the face of all the mockery. And I was just sort of free associating. They were saying, well, what is the story? What's your philosophy of editing? And I said, I don't know that there is a philosophy. It's not a dogma. It's not a system, in air quotes. It's just an intuitive process of looking at the story you wanted to tell. It's intuitively editing. And my friend just looked at me and said, intuitive editing. So yeah, as soon as she said it, I was like, that's exactly my philosophy. You have to bring all your analytical skills and all your craft skills that you have in your left brain, but there's so much of it that really you just feel the story you're trying to tell, and you tap into what makes all of us human, which is what makes story affecting. And that comes from your intuition.
Well, I'm so glad you shared that story, and I'm not going to join the choir on that one. I actually kind of like that title, your working title.
I did too. They said it sounded like a book on ophthalmology.
Oh, okay. Well, it's good to get that kind of feedback, and, and have people that will share that with you. I really enjoyed how people can use this book, and you break it down on things that they need to do with every chapter.
Mm-hmm. I broke it into craft elements. So each chapter, besides the intro chapters about how to approach an edit, and then I've got some about how to hire an editor and alternatives to a professional edit that bracket the craft part. But the edit itself, the main part of the book, each chapter is a main element of craft. Like character, we talked about a minute ago, and stakes and plot. I've got suspense and tension, point of view. And in each one, I delve deeper into a little bit just to sort of orient writers to what we're talking about and how that affects their story. But then I also break each chapter into two sections: how to find it and how to fix it, because editing and revision aren't quite the same thing. Editing, I think of as assessing. That's what I do. Revision is addressing. It's taking the observations that you made, or your beta readers or your critique partners helped you see, or that your editor pointed out, and deciding what may need to be strengthened or developed or tightened or changed, and how best to incorporate that into your work. Revision is another aspect of writing. Editing is really a different function, where it's kind of seeing what you have on the page. I think with our own writing, so many of us know what we want to say so much that as we read it, we're filling in the blanks mentally. So we don't always see what's on a page and how it might be coming across to a reader because of that, because we know what we meant to say. So that's where someone objective can come in handy. And it can be an editor. It can be the people I mentioned a minute ago, crit partner, beta reader. But it's also a skill in the author's toolbox that they can learn and get better at. Attaining that objectivity is one of the hardest things about, I think, being able to assess your own writing and figure out where it may need to be strengthened. But it is a skill you can learn. And that's another thing I wanted to share in the book, is that this isn't necessarily something you always have to farm out to someone else. This can be another editing. Honing that skill can be another tool in your toolbox. And in each chapter, I separated those two processes into how to find it is the editing portion. That's how to see what may or may not be coming across as effectively as it could on the page. And then how to fix it is how to take those specific things you've diagnosed in the editing process and incorporate them into revisions.
I like the part in your book where you talk about having to kind of, look for a new environment from where you really did the writing. And I think a lot of people are going, oh, I need to hear this because I need to book a trip now.
I joke about that. I'm like, go walk the Camino de Santiago.
Oh, yeah. That would be a little rough to do reading
right now. Yeah, there's, getting objectivity is such a difficult skill to learn, but there are some, and I always hate to use this word, so I'm going to put it in little metaphorical air quotes. There's tricks that you can do. The best trick to get objectivity is just to take time away, whatever that looks like for you. The longer, the better. But if you're on deadline or you're trying to get your manuscript out to agents, or for whatever reason, you just don't, you want to get it self-published, then you may not always have time. So one of the ones, as you pointed out, is just shake up your environment. If you're used to writing it at one desk in your house, go to a different room, go to the dining room table, or go to a coffee shop. Or I was just talking to an author the other day who said that genuinely she went on vacation right after she finished her first draft and started, while she was there, she just gave herself a few days off. And then she started reading it for edits. And she said just being in a new place away from her familiar environment made her look at it through a different lens and gives you that one level of remove. And then some of the really arcane things that can work are things like change the font that you wrote it in. As silly as that sounds, if it looks different to you, it kind of tricks your brain into seeing it as something outside yourself. Similarly, you can change the name on it. Most writers, either on the cover page or on each page in the header or the footer, will put the author name, put a different author name, not necessarily someone famous, but someone who's not you. Or, a good one is to load it onto your e-reader because it formats it like a book. And so you're used to reading in reader brain. So when I talk about editing and revising, I talk about the three different brains that every writer needs. And writer brain is one, editor brain is one, reader brain is one. So you're just in reader brain when you're reading your e-reader usually. And that's sort of that passive, let the story wash over you brain. And it can help, that brain can help you have that removed perspective so that you're not as intimately involved in the story as you're reading it, and you are seeing a bit more what's on the page. You can read it aloud. You can have some incredibly nice person read it to you, or a text-to-speech app can read it to you. And I think hearing it orally can let it strike you in a different way, and you will hear things that you didn't hear or that you didn't see when you were just reading it on the page. Or if you're used to reading it on your monitor, let's say, print it out and do it that way.
Lots of good tips there. And I think it would make such a huge impact using these. I really like, having someone read it to you, because that really kind of hones it in. Because if they start to stumble or it starts not to make a little sense, you can catch it right there.
Yeah. Or the dialogue doesn't sound realistic. Or this is one that I get all the time in my own writing. I just get bored. Like I'll be reading it out loud and I'll kind of disengage and realize, oh boy, that's a red flag. And that tells me there's something there that's not holding even my attention as the author, right? So it's clearly not going to hold a reader's attention, but it does wake you up to things like that.
Yeah. If you're checked out thinking of other things while you're reading, then it must be a big red flag, right?
Yeah. I mean, half of editing, and this is part of the intuitive part, it's not so much just picking up what's on the page, it's noticing your reactions. Because that's what we're trying to elicit as authors. We're trying to elicit a reaction in the reader. And so as you're taking something in, either in reader brain or editor brain, reader brain being that passive one, editor brain being the more analytical one, you want to notice what you're reacting to, because that's the first sort of breadcrumb. It's the first clue that will lead you to where a possible weakness in your story might be. So I used getting bored as an example. Often that can be a sign of stalling momentum in a story, or maybe we've lost sight of the character's push toward her goal. And so we don't feel invested in the story. Or maybe there's a whole bunch of description. And so we're kind of checked out because there's nothing really happening. So just the fact of observing how you are reacting is almost like the bait on the hook that leads you to be able to diagnose what the problem might be.
Well, it lets you really kind of sit with your manuscript and kind of fine tune it in many ways. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about, intuitive editing, because it really shows people, hey, you can do these step by step, and you don't have to be some, English major for, at Yale to be able to do this.
Yeah, I always joke that about revision mountain. when you finish your first draft and you're just staring up the side of revision mountain, it just feels like I can't do it. I will never get to the top. It's too much. But you do just exactly what you said. You take it one step at a time and break it down into little elements like that, and It's almost like the experience I told you I had when I was writing it. Before you know it, you're doing it and then you're done.
I need to hang out with you more often if that's how that all happens. You
No,
make
of
it
course
sound
I
so
am.
easy.
No, I was going to say I'm probably being a little bit rosy here because don't let me fool you, writers. Editing and revision is the hardest work of writing. Writing is like, I always joke, it's the sexy part. It's like courtship, like when you're having these effortless first dates and you guys have so much to talk about and nothing is wrong and everything is great. And then editing and revision are marriage. And they're awesome. And the rewards are potentially infinitely greater, but they also take a little bit more effort to be successful. So
sure.
I think like writing, like it's such an accomplishment to finish a first draft. It's a huge accomplishment. So many people say they want to write, and so few people actually finish something, but it is the first base camp up revision mountain. There's a long way to go after that. And that's the hard stuff, but it's also this is why I love editing. It's where the magic happens. It's where you get to take this amorphous idea in your head that you finally got on the page, and it's probably in decent shape. You got the bones of it on there, but now you get to really dig deep and get all the gold out of it and explore these characters and dig into this world you created and get the nuance out of it and the meaning and the levels and the depth, the stuff that makes it matter to readers, the stuff that makes a story stick with a reader.
I love how in your book you talk about just there are different ways that people can objectively approach their editing. Is that like a kind of area where people get a little stuck? Because I know they say don't name the puppy, and I mean, I'm sure people get really attached to their story and sometimes don't want to change it.
Yeah, a good editor should never try to take it over or make you change it. But I can't tell you how often major changes do happen in the editing process. And they may be ones that the author would have said, no, I will not change that. And then if you as an editor are seeing things that are hampering the story or not serving it as well as it could, and you point those things out in a positive and constructive way, and you support your reasoning as to why. Like, for example, I had an author once who had written a story with a love triangle. And one of my notes, which I don't often do big story things, I'm trying to help them get their story on the page effectively, not change their story. But in this case, everything that I saw in the story and everything I do, I'm taking from what I see on the page and how I'm trying to weave together the threads that I think are the author's intention into what seems to be the most effective version of their tapestry. And so in this story, she kept pushing the main character to go toward one of the love interests. And yet everything I saw in the story supported that it was the other one who was really a better match for her, which is a huge change. And it didn't fit her intention. But I called out specific examples of why. On page so-and-so, she says this. On page such and such, this happens between them. And we see how he understands her dreams in a way that the other one doesn't and supports them. And this and this and this. And I always say, if this is not working for you and I'm off base, let's talk about it and figure out a way to address some of the areas where this doesn't feel like it's holding together as well as it could so that it does. But let me make at least the case for what I see you might have been subconsciously setting up. And sure enough, as soon as she saw it, she was like, oh my God, you're right. He's perfect for her. And I really wanted her to end up with this guy because of this fact. And it could be a million things. I think in this case, the guy she had her character end up with was based on like a old boyfriend she had that she always felt like was the one who got away. But we have to kind of get past ourselves sometimes to see there's a magic that happens on the page. And much of it is created consciously by the author, but there is some kind of veil to another world that I think authors are the conduit to. And often you'll hear writers talk about the fact that the characters take on a life of their own and they start doing things that the author may not have foreseen or intentionally done. And I think you've got to be open to that happening. If you keep trying to force your characters where they want to go, if they evolve and decide to go somewhere else, that's when you get stuck or you create a story that does not resonate for readers.
That's so interesting that you bring that up because I've heard many authors say, well, I had to check in with the characters and they told me what was going on. It's like, that's really interesting because they're so kind of they're in tune with what the story is evolving as.
Well, they hopefully, if you're doing it right, then your characters, you are creating human beings. I mean, obviously they're not real, but you are mining out these nuances of who they are. And so they do kind of take on a life. Stephen King has a quote in his book on writing, which I keep trying to find and I can't find it. So now I'm thinking maybe this is apocryphal and I made it up, but I swear I think it's in there. He says something like, you set the world up and you set the stage and you create, what the situation's going to be, and you create your characters. And then what will they do? You don't know. They will come on stage and tell you. I just love that because they do. If you've done the work of setting up what is real for these characters, their world, their situation, then they will kind of start to put a hand on the wheel with you. I'm so not this person. Like I'm not all that woo-woo, but there really is something. I think the ancient Greeks talked about a veil that separated worlds. And they really did believe that creatives were the people who could penetrate the veil and bring some of what's on the other side into this world. And there is just something about that image, even if it's a myth. I think it's such a beautiful description of what creativity can be because you are weaving something out of really nothing, out of your imagination.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's where the magic happens, is being able to create something and use that imagination to develop something that maybe hasn't been thought of before. So I could see it being a completely different world, regardless if it's woo or no woo,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's something that didn't exist before the creator brought it into existence. And I don't know what that is, but there's something magical about that.
I would agree with you on that without a doubt. In your book, you talk about a couple different types of editing, and I was like, oh, okay, this is new. I didn't know about this, so it's new for me. And you talk about micro and macro editing. So what is that, and why would we pay attention to that?
So it's not so much that they're different types of editing necessarily. They're different. I think of them as different areas of editing. And to me, the macro edits are the big picture stuff. And by that, every editor will give you a different answer for this. It's as subjective a craft as writing is. But I think of that as character stakes and plot, or as I like to call them, the Holy Trinity. They are the tent poles of what story is. And if you sort of drop the ball on any of those, your story may not succeed. It will be significantly weakened because that's what makes story. And then the micro edit areas, you can think of it as more the fine tuning stuff, the supporting players. They're essential though. And that's things like suspense and tension, which belong in every genre, not just those genre, not just suspense or thriller or mystery. And using point of view well. Everybody thinks point of view is kind of simplistic, that it's, are you writing in he, she pronouns or I pronouns? But it's much more than that. It's point of view is the reader's window and vehicle into the story. And it affects how we perceive the story and how intimately we feel we know the characters and how affected we are by it. And so skillful use of point of view can heighten the impact of a story on your reader. And an unskillful use of it can yank them right out of the story. It just makes us feel like we're either being held at a remove, or if the point of view is uncertain, like it drifts and we're not sure whose experience we are directly a part of, then we just feel confused and we may disengage from the story. So that's one of the essential micro edit areas. I think what else I've got in there, showing and telling, which I never, you've probably heard show versus tell, like it's a cage match, which I don't think is the case. They both have a place in writing, just for lay listeners who may not be familiar with those terms. Showing would be like, let's start with telling. It's easier. Telling would be he's upset. That's just the author or the narrator conveying the fact of what's going on. Showing would be something like his hands clenched into fists at his side. He could feel a vein throbbing in his neck. Those are big cliches, so don't use those. But they both have their place. they're not showing. Everybody says, oh, showing is so much stronger. Yes, often it can be stronger for certain things. But if you show everything, you're going to have this tedious, endless story, which is a common mistake that newer writers make, is that they show every single thing from the minute a character wakes up all throughout their day. And we don't need all that. You can skip to that you can get past the parts readers skip, to paraphrase Elmore Leonard, and just go to the action of the story and sum up what we don't need to know that isn't essential. What we need to see, what is show, are things that directly impact the character, her arc, the story, raise the stakes. What you can tell is things like logistics, certain elements of backstories, things like that, where we need to know it, but you don't want to bog the story down in it. So the micro edit elements are what deepen, develop, or I'll use the silly metaphor that I use in intuitive editing. If you're building a house, macro elements are the foundation and I guess the studs. Micro editing elements would be, all the putting in the walls and the windows and the roof and everything that the house needs to be a house, the drywall, all of it. And then I also talk about sort of the line editing, the nitty gritty. This is what most people think of when they think of as editing, which is making the prose pretty and make it say what you want it to say. That's the last thing you should do. And I always liken that to staging the house, which is tons of fun. And again, that's the sexy part and everybody wants to jump to it. But you wouldn't start staging the house until you've got it built and solid and sound.
Is one of the things that you usually see where people kind of I wouldn't say necessarily make a mistake, or where I think it's where the story kind of slows down, is maybe their characters aren't three-dimensional enough or compelling enough.
Characters probably one of the trickiest things to do. And one of the areas, yes, where I most see authors sometimes struggle or just maybe not go deep enough. I just did a huge 3-day workshop on developing character. And I'm actually working on a follow-up for intuitive editing called intuitive character development. So I've been thinking about this a lot. And one of I'm a big fan of allegory and metaphor. And one of the images I always think of is, giving, I don't have children, full disclosure, but giving birth seems to me like, and raising a child seems to me like an impossibly huge undertaking. There's so many things to do and think about and worry about. And granted, these are fictional characters, but to me, that seems in some ways harder, because what you're not doing in raising a child is trying to invent who that person is from scratch. That is a really hard undertaking to decide. You can't just put cardboard characters into a story and expect readers to care about them. They have to feel real to us. And you can't, it's impossible to present a fully fleshed human being in every nuance in 80,000 words or whatever your manuscript is. But you've got to find a way to do that. And you can't just encyclopedia it out for readers. You have to find a way to not only flesh those characters out, but how to show that in the context of story in a way that continues to move the story forward. And also, one of the main elements of most story is that the character is undergoing a change. They have a character arc. So not only must you create this character and all of her foibles and experiences and traits and her personality and background and everything about her, but then you also have to show the change she's undergoing as a direct result of what's happening to her in the story. It's a phenomenal undertaking. And I think if we actually, just like with kids, if you sat and thought about how incredibly challenging it is, you might be afraid to ever take the first step on that path.
It could make you want to turn around if you don't get it right?
Yeah. I mean, there's the consequence, of course, different in fiction, the consequences for messing up, or maybe you don't get published or don't reach readers, but it's just so much to try to do that. I started as an actor. And one cool thing about that for what I do now is that the basis of acting is creating character. So I've thought a lot about this, and it's the same thing as an actor. You have to take, and you have the clue of the words on the page, but it's mostly just what they say, what they do. You don't know a whole lot of context outside of that. And so as the actor, and to a degree, the director, you have to invent that You have to make that person come to life. So to start bringing some of that into your writing, at the same time, you're also juggling 50 other balls, because character all by itself in a story will not engage readers either. You have to take them somewhere. You have to give them action and things to do. You have to make readers care about them. So you're juggling all these balls, and one of them is just enormous. Well, they are all enormous, but character especially is just really complex.
How important is it to have accurate research when someone's writing a book?
Do you mean into like your topic or characters, or how do you mean that?
It could be into the topic, or, like how Matthew McConaughey, who's in Interstellar, I mean, they did so
Oh,
much
yeah.
background for that. I mean, there was even a book that was published about, the science behind Interstellar, and they really did a lot of work on that to bring that to life.
Yeah, that was phenomenal. I was just thinking about that movie this morning because I was listening to an interview with Sandra Bullock talking about her movie Gravity, which I always sort of lump those two together because they both, I thought, were brilliant movies about science that kept you riveted. So it depends. I always joke that is the answer I most often give to questions, because it's a subjective art. But if you're writing something like that, for example, The Martian, God, the name of the author is escaping me right now, but that was originally written as one chapter at a time in installments. And I believe it wasn't fan fiction, but it was on, I may be getting some of these details wrong, but I think that he was publishing it week after week on like a blog or something like that, where the people who were reading it were weighing in on it also. And that's a very science-based story. And so these people who were reading it, a lot of them were scientists, very into the science. People who love a genre like that take their facts really seriously. So he's done interviews about this. He knew he had to get his facts exactly right. So he kind of crowdsourced some of that, like test driving it almost. But I think he did a ton of the research himself. Those are very researchy, heavy, fact-based stories. But if you're writing, for example, I work a lot in women's fiction. You may not need to do as much research on that unless, let's say you have, I have an author friend, Barbara Claypole White, who frequently writes about mental illness and things like bipolar disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. And so with something like that, you want to make sure you are getting the facts right, that you're being authentic, that you're being respectful. So there is a lot of research that goes into that. And then there's also, again, people who are not necessarily in the writing world, there's a whole new field that's come up in recent years that was called sensitivity read or edit. Now it's often called an authenticity read or edit. And that's where you get someone who either has this lived experience or is an expert in an area who can help make sure that you're not making egregious factual errors or potentially being offensive or showing unconscious bias or anything that might hamper your story or the reader's engagement with it. So it depends on what you're writing as far as how much research you need to do. As far as character development and research, though, besides like things like that, what their maybe situation may be where you need to have more information or a career that they may have where you want to be authentic, I always say that the best research you can do when you're creating characters is observe characters, and the characters in our lives are the people in it. So you observe like they're little lab rats, like they're little pithed frogs. You start to, most writers do this anyway. It's one of the reasons we got drawn to writing is that people fascinate us and we want to know why they do what they do. And you start paying attention to that in a more of an analytical way, or you start noticing your own reactions. You start noticing your own emotions. You start noticing what it feels like in your body when you're incredibly upset, so that you can describe that, so that you can make a reader feel that. And that kind of research, I think we're doing constantly as writers.
Yeah, and kind of moving all that forward. Well, and it has me thinking, with the plot, is this something that, most people will figure out or the characters write out as they continue to write the book?
So there are two schools of thought on writing, or two main schools of thoughts there. There's kind of a hybrid version of them, but most writers will refer to themselves as either a plotter or a pantser. And plotter, self-explanatory. They like to plot it all out ahead of time. There's authors like Jeffrey Deaver famously writes like 80-page outlines before he even starts writing his stories. He's a mystery writer. And then there are pantsers, and that's short for seat of the pants. Those are the writers who may have maybe an idea, some characters, a situation that they want to explore, and they just sit down and start writing. I think most writers probably are a hybrid of that, and they call that a plantser. But really, I think it's hard to do. Like if you plot out everything, then we talked a minute ago about how the story may veer in different ways. Here's an example I always use. How I Met Your Mother was a really successful sitcom. I think it had 10 seasons. And in its last show of its last season, about half the fans lost their minds with how they ended it, and half the fans liked it. And they turned the story on its head from where it had been going for the last, I think, 2 or 3 seasons, and completely went back to a storyline that they had early in the story, which a lot of fans like me were upset about because the story and the characters had evolved in a new direction and we had gotten invested in that direction and it didn't feel right. But other people, like my husband, felt that what the creator said was this was our original intention and we were headed there all along. My opinion is that the story and the characters took on a sort of a life of their own as the show went on. They couldn't have known it would last 10 years. Things evolve, characters evolve, and the organic evolution was the one they had headed toward the last couple of seasons, but they resisted that. So if you're a complete plotter and you make yourself be rigidly adherent to whatever you have decided you're going to do, you might run into a situation like that where you may not be serving the story as well as you could. But if you're a complete pantser, you can run out of steam, you can go off into dead ends, you can run in circles, you can just totally run out of gas and the story loses all its momentum because you have no idea where you're going. This one of my many, many metaphors. I liken this to, like, let's say you're taking a cross-country trip. You may be someone who wants to know every place you're going to stop and everything you're going to see and how long you're going to stay there and where you're going to end up. Or you may be somebody who just goes, you know what? I got 2 weeks in a car. Let's go see where I go. But either one of those could lead to problems. Things come up on the road. So if you have, if your car breaks down or you might miss something interesting because you're so rigidly adhering to your schedule. And if you're just don't even know where you're going to end up, who knows where you might end up? You may not have a good trip because you're just driving off in random circles where there's nothing to be seen because you didn't do any research on the trip. I think for most writers, there's a healthy balance to be found where whatever works for you as a writer, you at least lay out the main, I call them sort of the signposts on the journey. So you know who your characters are at the beginning, where they're coming from, you know where you want them to go roughly, and you know the key elements that you need to hit in the story to make sure that the story has structure and impacts the reader and takes them somewhere and that the character changes. But then within that framework, plot as much or as little as you need to that works for you as a writer. This is what it goes back to what we said earlier, that every author has to find the technique that works for them. And you can read widely and learn a bunch of craft, but none of it is going to be 100% right for you. You've got to take what serves your craft.
Yeah, really kind of focusing on that. I think with people, they just probably get better as they continue over time in developing their not only a niche market, but also their skill level.
Yeah. I mean, it's like any skill. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And that's one reason that writers are often encouraged to write regularly, because you've just got to flex the muscle. And because so many of the words you write are not going to be the ones that wind up in whatever your final product is, whether through revisions or just being discarded or because you're trying to find the story. So you've just got to put the time in, though. I think it's often attributed to Malcolm Gladwell, but I don't think he necessarily said it, but that it takes 10,000 hours to master anything. So you got to put your hours in, and the more you do it, the better you get. With each subsequent manuscript you write, you get more and more adept at these things, because a lot of them are like Waldo. Once you see them, you can never unsee them. Once you figure out, that every scene has to have some clear goal that the character is driving toward and something at stake. And we have to see what the character does in pursuit of that goal. Once you understand that every scene needs to move the story forward and that that's how you do it, you can't unknow that. And then you start writing with that approach in mind. So you're more and more skilled and, I guess, educated about your craft the more you go, just as in, any art. That's why musicians practice all the time.
Do you ever find that, let's say like you have a male author who's writing, women character parts, and they're, maybe they're a little off on some of the mannerisms, or is that a common thing?
I don't know if it's common, but I've definitely seen it before. One of women's pet peeves is when males will write female characters who do things like, they'll touch their own breasts, or or things that women are like, no, we don't really worry about that too much. Mm-hmm. So I have worked on a couple of those. It's hard to write, especially a direct frame of reference. If you're writing like a first person or an intimate third person point of view where you're actually in that character's head, it's really hard to get into the mindset of a gender that you may not have any internal experience of. So I get that. And that's where editors and outside readers can come in handy, or sensitivity readers. I wrote a character once who was transgender. I am not transgender. And so while I have some people in my life that's their experience and I've seen it secondhand, I don't know what that feels like. I know what they've told me. I know what I may have seen. I know what my imagination tells me it might feel like, but you need someone to help you figure out, did I get it right?
What if I'm writing something in regards to a character, a different ethnicity? I mean, how do we approach that?
Well, there's a lot of, that's been a hot topic in the publishing world for a while, because there's been very limited representation and diversity in publishing for a long time on both sides. Not just as authors, but within publishing, at publishing houses, there's just hasn't been a whole lot of diversity historically. And so I think the industry's been trying to correct that, and that's great. I also think the pendulum swings as we become more enlightened and more aware, and sometimes it swings farther than it needs to before it kind of corrects back. And right now there's thought that you should never write any lived experience outside your own. Some people will say that it's not kosher to do that. And I don't know how I feel about that. I've been trying to sort of think about this a lot because it has been so much a topic of discussion in the industry. If writers limit themselves only to their own lived experience, I feel like we're going to get very homogenous stories. We're going to lose a lot of the richness of life. And you're also kind of hog-tying an author's creativity, because that's part of what an author does is we think about the what ifs. We imagine, what would this be like? I'm not the characters that I'm writing. So on some level, I'm already doing that. And maybe I'm just doing it for a character that is a different race than I am, or different gender, or different sexuality, or different cultural background. Why is that? Why should we hamper a writer's ability to tell stories that represent the world as it is, which is a very diverse place, whether that means they're writing characters just like themselves as well as other characters? I think there's nuances to that. One of the things that people, I think, get concerned about is cultural appropriation, when that's very valid. But I don't know the answer to that. For me, I think that authors have to feel free to write whatever calls to them, and to represent the world as they see it, or they wish it could be, or whatever it is that their imagination is telling them. But I also think we have a duty to do that respectfully and authentically, and try to be as thorough and, I guess, I don't want to say enlightened, but as aware as possible. It's a large burden not a burden. It's a big responsibility that the author has, because story changes worlds, story changes minds, story changes people and cultures. It's the root of every major advance in our culture we've had, is that people start to see another way that is purely theoretical until it's not. And it comes to life in a story. And then people start to think, well, what if the world could be like that? And then we get, more increased women's rights. And then we get gay marriage. And then we get whatever, we get liberation, or civil rights, equal civil rights. It starts with story. And we have to be mindful of the fact that we have, not to overstate it, that power. And we have to use it for good.
Amen to that.
And use it responsibly.
Yeah. And because there's a lot to take into consideration, which leads me to my next question. Let's talk about feedback. How important is feedback to an author's story?
It depends. I told you you'd see that again. There are some stories that are very difficult to write, or that baffle the author, or where you get stuck, or you can't see your way through, or you think you have, but you're not getting the response you wanted to get from, say, agents or publishers or readers. And so somewhere you've missed the mark, and maybe you're too close to it. You can't figure out what it is. My metaphor for that, and there is always one, is when you're writing a story, you're in the forest and you're trying to see the path through, but all you can see is the thicket in front of you. And sometimes you need somebody who's got that drone view who can say, turn left, it's over here. I can see the whole path and here's where you're headed. So if you don't always need to hire an editor. I want to say that out front, because I think there's a myth in the business right now, since the explosion of particularly freelance editors with when self-publishing became so popular, and indie pub and small press, there was an explosion of freelance editors. And suddenly it became sort of normal to talk about the fact that part of the process is you write your story and then you hire your editor and then you do your revisions. And that can be very helpful, but it isn't necessary. Editing is a tool in an author's toolbox and a skill that an author should have and develop. And you can improve it, and you can learn to assess your own story. And when you can't, you can find ways to get outside feedback as you need it. So, for example, with intuitive editing, I did need to know how effective it was, and whether it was saying what I needed it to say, whether it was confusing, whether it felt redundant, whether it was written at the right level for a variety of, writers at all levels. And so I didn't hire an editor for that. I didn't feel that I needed one, not because I'm an editor, but because I knew what I was saying, and it was extremely organized and laid out based on years of developing these theories. And it was nonfiction, and I knew what I wanted to say and had done my research, but I did need to know how effective it was. So I had beta readers for that. And beta readers are basically just usually lay people, not necessarily writers, but they're just people that you go, hey, can you read my book and tell me what you see? And they may just give you their impressions, or often I'll advise authors to give people a questionnaire, especially with people who are not writers. They may not know how to give feedback. Like, bless my husband's heart, the first time I let him read one of my manuscripts, I was like, well, what did you think? And he goes, it was good. And I said, okay, thanks. But what did you think? Like, what do I need to improve? What's working? What's not working? And he goes, yeah, it was good. He's not a writer. He doesn't have the vocabulary for that. But if I give people a questionnaire that says, let's say I'm talking about one of my fiction books. Did you lose interest anywhere? Did any of the characters not feel believable to you? Was the ending satisfying to you? So I ask really specific questions that any reader could answer. And I know how to turn those into, any author will learn how to turn those into what may or may not need editing and revision. So I think feedback's incredibly valuable for the reason I said it's hard to get objectivity on your own work. And it's like a test drive, before you're going to get it in front of a bunch of readers, wouldn't it be nice to get it in front of a few trusted readers who can let you know, hold up the mirror and say, is this doing what I need for it to do? But do you always need to hire a professional edit, which an editor can cost thousands of dollars, and finances should never be a barrier to a creative pursuit? So for that and a lot of reasons, do you always need to hire someone to do that? You do not. There are plenty of ways you can learn to hone this skill in yourself, and plenty of places you can figure out how to get the feedback that you do need. When you do need a professional editor is when you have gotten stuck in a story, or you're not getting the response you want and you don't know why. You've done everything you're capable of doing. You've polished this to the best of your abilities, and something still hampering the story and you can't see it, that's when you call in a professional. Just like you wouldn't go to a doctor for a stubbed toe or every little health complaint. You go when it's beyond your ability to do it.
I like that analogy. Yes, it really puts things in perspective. And well, my goodness. Tiffany, I mean, we could talk for hours. I just loved your book, Intuitive Editing. I understand you have courses and just different events that people can be a part of and learn from. Where can they go for that? And what type of courses do you have?
Oh, thank you. First, thanks for the words on intuitive editing. That means really a lot to me. This book is just a work of my heart. So the best place is my website, foxprinteditorial.com. And over the years, I've really built and evolved the website because I want it to be a resource for authors. So there's a ton of content on there that should help authors. There's a resources page that has a bunch of free downloadables for authors, things like a self-editing checklist. After you think it's as edited as you can get it, this is just a really thorough checklist to see, have you hit all these notes? And I have a Get It Edited guide. If you're thinking of hiring an editor, it's a very comprehensive guide on where to find good editors, how to vet them, how to know if you have a good one, what to ask, what a sample edit should look like, what should it cost, what red flags to look for. And then I've got a whole bunch of other places that authors can go to get more information on craft. I also have a weekly blog where I talk about craft and writing life and challenges writers face, and a newsletter you can subscribe to get that. And I do have my online courses, which most of them are specific areas of craft that I dig deeper into. And they all have like supplemental materials that'll help you work through things, exercises, stuff like that. But I have a course on suspense, and I have a course on creating a plot, developing an airtight plot, whether before you start writing or making sure the plot you've written is airtight.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. Can you share your website with us one more time?
Yeah, foxprinteditorial.com for all things writing. And then if you're interested in the fiction, it's phoebefoxauthor.com, but you can also link to that right from Foxprint Editorial and vice versa.
Tiffany, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you, Marianne, for having me again. I just really always love chatting with you. It's like having coffee with an old friend.
Oh my goodness, I could not agree with you more. We always have so much fun talking about not only the new books you have, but the programs as well. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.